Welcome back to The Shadows. Before we uncover tonight's archived file, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never get lost in the dark. There is a precise, quiet moment when a written manuscript stops being a mere record of the past and begins acting as an active conduit for cold reality. Deep within the climate-controlled archivist vaults of the New England Historical Society, heavy cardboard boxes bound in black and twill sit in isolation. File 29C did not originate from a standard local parish or town hall registry. It was extracted from the floorboards of an abandoned stone rectory. It was found in Oakhaven, a remote village completely swallowed by the dense spruce forests of the Berkshire Mountains in the autumn of 1928. The pages inside are made of thick, unbleached parchment, bound together with dried sinew that rattles like dead beetles when the volume is opened. The text was not inked with a pen, but carved into the fibrous surface with a sharp iron bodkin, each letter filled with a dark, crystalline powder. The powder tastes faintly of a dry riverbed and burnt mountain ash. The ledger was maintained by Reverend Gabriel Vance, a scholar who documented the exact process by which an entire congregation unlearned prayer. They systematically replaced their daily supplications with absolute, terrifying silence. The opening entry, dated September 14, 1928, establishes a hook that grips the reader with cold, unwavering certainty. If you are reading these lines aloud, stop immediately, for the words carved upon this skin do not remain confined to the room in which they are spoken. Gabriel Vance was not a religious fanatic. He was a trained scholar of classical theology sent by the diocese to investigate the village. He was sent to learn why the iron church bells of Oakhaven had ceased ringing during the harvest season. What he found was a settlement that had turned entirely inward, its inhabitants moving between their homesteads with a haunting, fluid grace. They refused to cross the wooden thresholds of their houses until they had checked the dust beneath their doorframes. The village stood in a deep, glacial basin where the autumn fog never fully dissipated, hanging over the hemlock canopy like a gray shroud. In his first night at the rectory, Gabriel observed that the townspeople did not gather in the pews for evening vespers. Instead, they assembled in absolute, breathless silence around the perimeter of the churchyard, their faces turned toward the dense timber line. They stared directly where the ancient parish boundary stone sat embedded in the dark soil. The silence was not merely the absence of speech. It was a physical weight that pressed against the chest, altering how sound traveled through the valley. When Gabriel attempted to sing a psalm in the empty sanctuary, his voice sounded unnaturally thin. The reverberation died in his throat as though swallowed by the cold lime plaster of the walls. In the ledger, he noted that the parish records extending back to 1690 had been systematically defaced. Every name recorded in iron gall ink had been scraped clean with a razor, leaving translucent windows in the rag paper. In their place, the villagers had carved interlocking geometric marks that resembled the cross-section of a hollow bone. "They are not forgetting their names," Gabriel wrote, his carved strokes growing deeper and more jagged as entries progressed. "They are surrendering them to the entity that lives in the dry earth beneath the wellhead, a presence they refer to only as the silent neighbor. It does not demand blood, nor does it ask for sacrifice. It demands the unsaid thoughts that accumulate in the throat when a man sits alone." By the end of his first week, Gabriel realized that the villagers had ceased speaking to their children. The infants did not cry. They sat on the cold floorboards of their timber homes, watching the corners with wide, unblinking eyes. Their small hands traced slow, circular patterns in the accumulating dust. Every evening at sunset, the head of each household would kneel upon their hearthstone and carve a line of script onto cured deer hide. These hides were carried into the woods and stuffed into the narrow fissures of ancient oak trees. Gabriel followed an elder, Thomas Miller, into the forest on a moonless Tuesday. He watched from behind a thicket of mountain laurel as Miller pressed his forehead against the damp bark of a hollow pine. Miller whispered a single, unintelligible syllable into the dark cavity before sealing the opening with blue clay. When Gabriel approached the tree an hour later and scraped away the clay, he did not find a message written in English or Latin. He found 3 human teeth embedded in the sap, their roots pointing directly toward the center of the earth. The rain that swept across the Berkshire Ridge on the night of October 2nd did not wash the blue clay away. It did not wash the blue clay from the hollow trees scattered deep within the forest. Instead, it softened the soil surrounding the old rectory until the stone foundations shifted. The heavy foundation began to shift with a low, agonizing groan in the dark night. Inside his damp study, Reverend Gabriel Vance sat by the weak light of a kerosene lamp. He watched the parchment pages of his journal absorb the heavy dampness hanging in the air. His own handwriting had begun to alter slowly over the past several harrowing days. It was losing its precise, scholarly flourish in favor of sharp, angular incisions. These jagged cuts closely mirrored the strange carvings he had discovered in the woods. The silence inside the rectory had become so intense that he could hear his own body. He could hear the steady, rhythmic clicking of his fingernails tapping the oak desk. It was a sharp sound that echoed off the bare walls like small falling pebbles. It sounded like dry stones falling into the dark depths of a cold, empty well. He wrote with an urgent, frantic speed, documenting the disturbing physical changes. He carefully recorded the subtle alterations that were beginning to manifest in his body. These horrors grew stronger as he spent more time within the boundary of the basin. The taste of salt has returned to my mouth. The entry for October 4th read clearly. The sharp iron stylus cut so deeply into the parchment that it punctured the page. It does not come from the simple food or the well water, which remains clear. It rises constantly from the back of my tongue whenever I attempt to speak names. Yesterday, I tried to recite the Lord's Prayer aloud while standing at the altar. My tongue felt heavy and dry, like a piece of salted beef left in the hot sun. The sacred words would not form no matter how hard I pressed my trembling lips. When I forced my breath past my lips, the only sound that emerged was a dry rustle. It sounded like dead autumn leaves being swept across a cold flagstone floor. Gabriel leaned back in his chair, his heart hammer-striking violently against his ribs. He heard a soft, deliberate dragging sound coming from the central aisle of the church. The sound echoed from the dark sanctuary located just beyond his study door. He picked up his heavy brass lantern, raising the burning wick to cast yellow light. The pale flame cast long, wavering shadows across the cold, lime-washed stone walls. He pushed the heavy oak door open, stepping onto the cold floor of the nave. The wooden pews were empty, their dark timber polished smooth by generations past. Yet the air in the central aisle was noticeably colder than inside his warm study. It carried the distinct, suffocating smell of damp peat, river silt, and stale wine. In the center of the aisle was a narrow, unbroken trail of fine gray dust. It extended all the way from the rear entrance to the sacred communion rail ahead. It was not ordinary wood ash or chimney soot gathered from an open hearth fire. It was composed of tiny, calcified fragments of bone and crushed river shells. These tiny fragments sparkled faintly beneath the warm beam of his lantern light. Gabriel knelt slowly, pressing his fingers into the cold, fine gray powder below. He realized with a sickening jolt that the trail was laid in 2 parallel lines. They formed the exact geometric symbol he had seen carved in the defaced registers. As he traced the line toward the altar, a faint, rhythmic tapping sound echoed. The rhythmic sound resonated from beneath the floorboards directly beneath his boots. It was a slow, measured knock, 3 distinct raps, followed by a long pause. Then 3 distinct raps came again from the dark void hidden far below. The sound traveled toward the stone trapdoor that led into the old burial vault. Gabriel held his breath, lowering his lantern until the flame lit the iron ring. The iron ring embedded in the stone hatch was covered in a thin layer of white frost. As he reached out to touch the frost, he noticed a fresh strip of deer hide. Written upon the hide in dark, wet ink was his own full name in clear script. It was followed by a sentence that chilled his soul. "The neighbor has measured your silence." The passage down into the burial vault beneath the chancel was not a gentle descent. It was a steep, terrifying drop into the earth's cold, damp, unyielding throat. Detective-turned-observer Gabriel Vance lowered his heavy brass lantern through the hatch. He watched the pale yellow light flicker violently as a subterranean draft rushed up. The subterranean draft rushed upward from the deep, uncharted cavern hidden below. The air below smelled suffocatingly of stagnant well water and old river clay. It carried the suffocatingly sweet, nauseating odor of decaying hemlock roots. As his heavy leather boots made contact with the earthen floor of the vault below, the moisture hanging thick in the dark air condensed instantly upon his wool coat. The damp cold turned the heavy wool fabric stiff, damp, and uncomfortably heavy. The cellar was far older than the 1928 stone church built directly above it. The dry-stacked fieldstones forming the cold walls were covered in thick lichen. The gray lichen appeared to absorb the yellow light rather than reflect it back. In the center of the subterranean chamber lay an ancient, massive stone hearth. Its heavy hearthstone was cracked cleanly down the middle as if struck by lightning. It looked as though it had been struck by a powerful bolt from deep beneath. Spread across the cold stone surface was not charred firewood or cold ash. It was a dense, fibrous pulp made entirely of crushed bone and pine needles. Gabriel knelt slowly beside the hearth, his cold fingers trembling with fear. He drew his pocket knife and carefully probed the soft, pale mixture below. The bone pulp was still damp, yielding a clear, viscous fluid upon the knife. The fluid smelled faintly of dry river salt and cold, oxidized iron scrap. As he pushed the steel blade deeper into the mixture, it struck something hard. It struck a hard, smooth object deeply embedded in the exact center of stone. He worked the object free, wiping away the gray slime with his handkerchief. He found himself holding a small, heavy silver pocket watch in his palm. The clear glass cover was intact, but the face inside was completely obscured. It was completely obscured by a thin, white root that had grown inside it. The root had grown tightly around the brass hands, pinning them permanently. They were pinned permanently to exactly 3 minutes past midnight in the dark. Gabriel held the watch close to his cold ear, his heart hammer-striking hard. His heart struck violently against his ribs as he heard the faint ticking. The faint, rhythmic ticking of internal gears still turning beneath the root. "It does not measure the hours of the day, Gabriel," a voice whispered softly. The voice whispered from the darkened alcove, hidden directly behind the hearth. It was a voice that did not enter through his ears at all in the room. It resonated directly within the cold, dense bones of his trembling skull. He spun around quickly, raising his lantern into the pitch-black shadows ahead. Yet the yellow beam revealed only empty, hollow shadows clinging to fieldstones. The heavy journal beneath his coat felt unnaturally hot against his cold chest. It radiated a steady, feverish warmth that matched the ticking of the watch. He opened the ledger with a shaking hand, illuminating the third page clearly. The carved text had begun to spill into the wide margins of parchment. It formed intricate geometric patterns that mirrored the root growth inside. The entry for October 8th was written in a hand that no longer seemed his. The carved letters were wide, flat, and gouged deeply into the rag paper. Several words were nearly carved out entirely by the sharp iron stylus tip. The villagers do not buy flour or salt from the valley market anymore. They bring their wooden bowls to the edge of the wellhead at dusk quietly. They wait for the blue clay to push upward through the iron grate below. They eat the clay raw, spreading it upon their tongues like thick lard. When I asked Thomas Miller why his teeth were missing, he opened his mouth. He showed me that his gums had grown smooth and hard, like polished marble. He told me that speech is an infection, and the neighbor cauterizes it. By midnight, the storm over the Berkshire Ridge had reached its absolute peak. It drove thick sheets of freezing rain against the heavy oak timbers above. Gabriel remained in the cold vault, his back pressed against the fieldstone wall. He read through the frantic, jagged entries written in mid-October darkness. His flashlight beam was growing noticeably dimmer with every passing minute. It was now his primary light source after the lantern oil had burned away into soot. The fading battery cast a weak, amber circle onto the damp, cold floorboards. The persistent tapping sound beneath his heavy leather boots had finally ceased. It was replaced by a low, continuous vibration that hummed through his feet. The subterranean hum made his teeth ache with a dull, persistent, deep pain. He turned to the entry dated October 12th in the thick, dry parchment volume. The writing on the page had abandoned all pretense of traditional grammar now. "The names are completely gone from my mind now," Gabriel had recorded clearly. The sharp iron stylus marks cut straight through 2 consecutive parchment pages. "I can remember the exact faces of my beloved mother and sister in my mind. Yet when I try to attach a spoken name to their features, my throat fills. My throat fills instantly with dry dust whenever I attempt to speak names. The silent neighbor does not use spoken words to command us in the dark. It uses the unbearable physical weight of the cold air inside the room. When it wishes us to step toward the dark forest line, the air grows heavy. The air behind us grows heavy and cold, pressing against our shoulder blades. It presses against our shoulder blades like a massive, unyielding iron slab. When it wishes us to remain completely silent, our jaws lock together firmly. They lock together until the dry skin around our trembling lips begins to tear. A sharp, crystalline crack echoed through the deep subterranean stone vault. It was followed by the distinct sound of heavy timber snapping under tension. The massive wooden joists snapped under immense pressure in the sanctuary above. Gabriel raised his fading flashlight beam toward the dark ceiling joists above. He watched as small streams of fine gray dust began to filter down quickly. The dust filtered down through the narrow gaps in the damp oak floorboards. The gray dust did not fall straight down toward the cold earthen floor below. It drifted sideways, pulled toward the ancient stone hearth by an invisible draft. It was drawn by a localized, unnatural draft moving through the chamber air. As he watched in horror, the gray pulp on the hearthstone began to shift. It rose into small, perfectly round mounds that resembled burrowing insect hives. From within the dark alcove behind the hearth, a tall silhouette detached itself. A gaunt, towering silhouette emerged silently from the pitch-black shadows. Its feet made no sound as it stepped into the shallow pool of cold water. The figure wore the tattered, dry remnants of a 19th century clerical cassock. Its pale face was completely covered by a thick, blue clay mask in the dark. The clay mask had dried and cracked into intricate geometric fissures and lines. In its gaunt right hand, it held a sharp, heavy iron bodkin stylus firmly. The iron tool was identical to the one Gabriel used to carve the ledger entries. The strange creature did not move directly toward Gabriel in the dark chamber. Instead, it reached out and pressed its thumb against the stone hatch center. It sealed the only exit with a thick, wet layer of heavy river silt below. The dark silt froze instantly upon direct contact with the cold air around. "Your work is nearly finished, Reverend," the gaunt figure hissed in dark. The raspy voice carried the dry quality of stone sliding over coarse sand. "The ledger requires one final entry to close the parish boundary forever." The passage of time within the subterranean vault had lost all connection to reality. It had lost all connection to the natural order of the cold world above. Reverend Gabriel Vance sat pinned against the slick, dry-stacked stones in dark. He watched the blue clay mask of the gaunt figure standing directly before him. The cracked mask reflected the fading amber ember of his dying flashlight beam. The rectory floorboards overhead groaned violently under a slow, rhythmic weight. It felt less like human footsteps and more like the heavy shift of river clay. The wet clay was settling heavily against the ancient oak timbers of the floor. From the dark shadows surrounding the hearth, small bone fragments drifted up. These small, calcified fragments continued to drift upward through stagnant air. They hung suspended like pale, dead stars in a dark, silent subterranean sky. Gabriel raised his trembling hand, his fingers clutching the iron bodkin stylus. He had pulled the iron tool from his coat pocket only moments before. His trembling palm was slick with cold, sticky sweat and dry river salt. "There is no synod remaining in Boston to receive your reports, Gabriel," it said. The figure whispered in a dry, rasping voice that emerged from the stones. The sound seemed to emerge from the stone walls rather than its sealed lips. "They read your frantic letters 3 weeks ago in their warm offices." Yet the dark ink turned to dry salt upon the parchment paper very quickly. It turned to salt before the tired courier ever reached the parish line. The distant diocese believes Oakhaven was abandoned long ago in history. They believe it was abandoned during the timber blights of 1840. They do not know that the valley simply stepped backward into the earth. It stepped quietly backward into the silent, cold earth beneath the mountains. Gabriel pressed his back harder against the cold granite wall of the vault. His dry throat was closing around a dry, metallic lump that tasted of lye. It tasted sickeningly of wet lye, dry river ash, and oxidized copper scrap. He forced his eyes back down to the parchment pages resting on his knees. His flashlight beam flickered once, twice, in the damp subterranean darkness. It settled into a weak, reddish glow that barely illuminated the gouged script. The entry for October 16th had been carved with immense, terrifying force. The sharp iron stylus had ripped straight through 3 consecutive leaves. It left jagged, blackened tears along the wide margins of the rag paper. "The congregation no longer gathers in the church sanctuary," the text read. Each carved character was filled with dark, sparkling dust in the grooves. The dark powder seemed to feed continuously upon the ambient dampness around. "They stand at 30-pace intervals along the perimeter of the timber line. Their backs are turned to their homes, their heads tilted slightly upward. They keep their pale faces turned quietly toward the dense forest canopy. They do not blink when the cold mountain fog rolls through their ranks." Thomas Miller's wife stood beside the wellhead for 48 hours straight. She stood without shifting her heavy leather boots in the damp river silt, until the roots of the hemlocks grew up through her worn leather soles. The creeping roots bound her ankle bones firmly to the boundary stone. Gabriel's fingers closed tightly around the binding of the ancient book. A sudden, sharp crystalline crack resonated through the floor beneath his feet. The thick blue clay covering the figure's face began to fissure rapidly. Thin white lines spread across the cheekbones under immense internal pressure. From deep within the cracks, tiny streams of dry white salt poured forth. The salt cascaded down the ragged wool of the cassock into the water below. It filled the shallow pool of stagnant water gathered around Gabriel's boots. The creature reached out its gaunt hand, its long fingers pointing directly. Its bone-pale fingers pointed directly at the empty space beneath his chest. "Write the final names, Gabriel," the dry voice rasped softly in the dark. The raspy voice carried the quiet, suffocating warmth of a cold, ash-filled hearth. "Or the neighbor will use your throat to sing the silence into the valley." The reddish light from the dying flashlight died entirely in the dark chamber. It plunged the deep burial vault into absolute, unbroken, pitch-black darkness. Gabriel Vance remained completely motionless in the freezing pitch-black cold. His heavy breath came in short, shallow gasps that smelled of old paper. It smelled faintly of ancient parchment paper and damp, stagnant river silt. The silence in the subterranean chamber was no longer passive or quiet now. It thrummed continuously with a low, heavy vibration that rattled the watch. It rattled the silver pocket watch still tucked deeply in his trousers. In the complete absence of all light, his other senses sharpened greatly. They sharpened to an agonizing degree in the pitch-black subterranean void. He could hear the slow, rhythmic expansion of ancient tree roots above him. He heard them squeezing between the cold fieldstones of the ancient cellar. He could feel the faint, freezing draft rising from the central hearth crack. The draft carried the distinct, metallic perfume of damp iron and bone. It carried the sickening smell of damp, oxidized iron and crushed river bone. Slowly, deliberately, Gabriel opened the heavy ledger across his cold lap. He relied entirely on touch to guide the sharp point of his iron stylus. He guided the stylus along the rough, fibrous surface of the parchment paper. His fingertips traced the deep, jagged gouges carved by previous hands past. He felt the cold, crystalline powder that filled the deep-carved grooves. As his thumb brushed against the final blank page of the dry volume, a faint, bioluminescent glow began to emanate from the dark powder below. It cast an eerie, pale blue light across his cold, trembling knuckles. The light illuminated the lower half of his pale, hollow face clearly. The pale light was cold and thin, illuminating the geometric marks fully. They had begun to form completely spontaneously on the rag paper surface. The marks shifted and reconfigured like iron filings in a magnetic field. "The survey of the parish is complete," Gabriel wrote in the dark ledger. His hand moved across the parchment with an unnatural, mechanical fluidness. It moved with a terrifying fluidness that he could no longer control at all. The iron stylus gouged deeply into the paper, tearing small crescents out. The blue light grew steadily brighter in the subterranean vault chamber. "The names of the 34 souls of Oakhaven have been scraped clean. They have been scraped clean from the book of life forever in the dark, and carved into the living rock beneath the wellhead in deep earth. The silent neighbor does not require a temple built of timber or stone. Its sanctuary is the empty space left in the human throat at last. It lives where the last sacred prayer is forgotten in total silence." A heavy thud sounded from the stone hatch above in the dark sanctuary. It was followed by the slow, wet scraping of ancient iron hinges opening. The rusty hinges were forced open against decades of thick rust and salt. Gabriel raised his head, the pale blue light casting long, twisted shadows. The light cast distortion-filled shadows across the vaulted ceiling above. Looking up through the open square hatch, he saw no starlight or night sky. He saw only a dense, motionless wall of blue clay sloughed down in dark. The blue clay had sloughed down from the rectory foundations above him. It was completely sealing the chancel overhead in thick, suffocating mud. Standing at the edge of the opening, looking down with hollow eyes, the 34 missing parishioners of Oakhaven stood silently in dark. Their pale faces were completely smooth and featureless in the blue light. Their lips were sealed together under thick layers of dried river silt. Their pale hands were held out in unison toward the glowing ledger. From the crowd, a single hand reached down through the dark square. It held an ancient brass surveyor's chain that swung slowly back and forth. It swung slowly back and forth like a heavy, silent pendulum in time. The blue clay sealing the stone hatch of the burial vault did not remain moist. Within hours, it crystallized into a brittle, glass-like shell in the freezing cold. It locked the only exit beneath 3 feet of subterranean frost and ice below. Reverend Gabriel Vance sat on the cold floorboards of the inner cellar floor. His back was pressed hard against the dry-stacked fieldstones in total dark. He watched the bioluminescent ink in his ledger cast long, wavering fingers. Long fingers of blue light stretched continuously across the heavy ceiling joists. The terrifying silence of Oakhaven had settled into a heavy physical entity. It became a cold, dense fog that seeped through crevices in the masonry walls. The thick fog carried the faint, sweet scent of crushed hemlock in the damp air. It carried the nauseating odor of old river silt gathered beneath the well. Every breath Gabriel drew felt heavy and abrasive inside his burning lungs. It felt as though his lungs were slowly filling with fine white salt granules. His fingers, stiff from the frigid dampness, moved across the fibrous paper. They moved across parchment with a rhythmic, mechanical precision in the dark. His hand was driven not by his own volition, but by the relentless thrumming. The heavy vibration thrummed through the floorboards from deep beneath earth. It vibrated continuously from beneath the ancient parish boundary stone. He turned to the leaf marked October 20th in the thick parchment journal. The carved script had completely abandoned English sentence structure now. It resolved into long columns of geometric coordinates and ancient land parcels. The archives of the Berkshire parish were not lost in the fire of 1840. They were buried beneath the root system of the valley to preserve weight. They were buried to preserve the exact weight of the soil above the vault. The villagers do not speak because their voices are being used constantly. Their lost voices anchor the ancient survey lines across the valley floor. Every word uttered in the upper world weakens the seal on the salt pulp. It weakens the seal on the hearth below, allowing dry earth to claim wood. It allows the dry earth to claim another foot of heavy timber above us. Gabriel paused, tracing his thumb over dark, sparkling impressions on paper. The sparkling impressions formed the exact outline of the old parish map. Outside the subterranean vault, a dull, rhythmic thumping began to echo clearly. The heavy thumping echoed along the stone drainage tunnel in the darkness. It sounded like heavy leather boots stepping slowly through deep, wet clay. The pale light from the ledger flickered violently in the subterranean cellar. Its pale blue hue darkened to a deep, bruised violet color in the dark. The light shifted as the heavy footsteps reached the sealed iron hatch above. Gabriel did not raise his head to look up at the dark hatch opening. He knew that the gaunt figure standing on the other side was not human. It was no longer the salt-encrusted curate or Thomas Miller standing there. It was the accumulated shadow of every parishioner in the Oakhaven Valley. They were the ones who had surrendered their name to the deep wellhead. The iron ring on the stone hatch groaned under tremendous, crushing pressure. The frozen blue clay around its frame fractured into spiderweb cracks. It showered fine white dust onto the cold oak floorboards below his boots. "The survey requires your final signature." "Gabriel," the dry voice echoed. The rasping voice echoed through the iron keyhole in the freezing dark. It sounded like dry leaves being crushed beneath a heavy iron wheel. "The 34 souls of Oakhaven have yielded their accounts at last. You are the last scribe, and the ledger cannot be closed in total peace. The ledger cannot be closed while your tongue retains a sacred prayer." A sudden, violent crack shattered the subterranean stillness of the cellar vault. The heavy iron hatch bowed inward under tremendous, unnatural force from above. Its ancient, rusted hinges snapped like dry twigs under the crushing weight. Cold, stagnant air rushed violently into the dark chamber from the opening. It brought with it a blinding cloud of fine, white, crystalline salt dust. The salt dust coated the dry-stacked walls and the old floorboards thoroughly. It covered Gabriel's worn wool coat in a pale, glistening layer of frost. Through the swirling white haze, the gaunt outlines of 34 souls emerged. The 34 parishioners emerged slowly, moving in absolute, terrifying unison. They did not possess distinct human facial features or expressions anymore. Their pale faces were smooth masks formed entirely of hardened blue clay. Their eyes were replaced by shallow, hollow indentations in the clay mask. These indentations were filled with sparkling, microscopic salt crystals. The crystals reflected the deep purple bioluminescent glow of the ledger. Gabriel stood up slowly, clutching the leather-bound volume to his chest. He felt the intense, feverish heat of the parchment burn through his shirt. He stepped backward cautiously until his heels struck the ancient hearth rim. The crushed bone and fibrous pine pulp yielded beneath his leather boots. It yielded with a soft, wet crunch that echoed in the dark stone cellar. The silent figures stopped at the outer edge of the hearthstone circle. Their pale, clay-covered hands were raised together in a single gesture. They raised their hands in a synchronized motion toward the glowing book. "The land does not belong to the church, nor does it belong to state," it said. The collective voice whispered silently from their sealed, featureless lips. The dry, rasping sound echoed continuously in the marrow of Gabriel's bones. "It belongs to the line drawn before the ancient trees ever had names. Surrender the stylus, Gabriel, and let the soil remember its unwritten peace." He raised his right hand slowly, the sharp iron bodkin gleaming faintly. The steel point gleamed under the violet bioluminescent light of the ledger. He aimed the sharp point not at the approaching, gaunt figures around him. He aimed the iron tool directly at the center of his own trembling palm. With a swift, deliberate motion, he drove the iron stylus into his flesh. He used his own warm blood to saturate the dark, crystalline powder resting. The blood saturated the powder resting in the deep gouges of the manuscript. It filled the carved gouges of the manuscript's final parchment page. The chemical reaction was instantaneous and terrifying in the pitch black. The pale blue bioluminescence erupted into a blinding flash of golden light. The golden flash scorched the white salt frost completely from the stones. It sent a violent, shuddering shockwave tearing through the root ceiling. The shockwave tore through the root-bound timber ceiling of the vault above. The clay-masked figures recoiled violently in the blinding golden light. Their stiff, pale bodies shuddered as ancient oak timbers groaned in agony. The massive timbers began a massive, irreversible collapse overhead in dark. The collapse threatened to bury the subterranean archive beneath stone. It threatened to bury everything beneath hundreds of tons of Berkshire stone. Hundreds of tons of ancient mountain rock and wet, suffocating river silt. The collapse of the subterranean burial vault did not bring down the church. It did not bring down the heavy granite foundation of the church above. Instead, it compressed the damp Berkshire clay around fieldstone walls. It compressed the soil, forming a sealed, airtight pocket in dark earth. It created a pocket 40 feet beneath the dark, quiet forest floor above. Reverend Gabriel Vance lay trapped beneath a fallen beam of petrified oak. His tired body was pinned firmly in the dark, cold silt of the vault. Yet the heavy leather ledger remained firmly lodged against his ribs. The blood from his palm had dried into a dark, vitreous crust on parchment. It dried across the final leaf of parchment in the cold subterranean dark. The blood glowed with a soft, persistent gold that cast a narrow beam. The golden light cut through the swirling white dust filling the chamber. In the absolute isolation of the pit, the cold silence began to retreat. The suffocating silence of Oakhaven was replaced by a deep vibration. A deep, resonant vibration hummed continuously through the living stone. The dark earth surrounding Gabriel was not merely dead, cold stone. It was a vast, ancient ledger of its own, extending deep into the earth. Every single grain of sand held the clear impression of a lost word. It held the everlasting memory of a forgotten word or an unuttered prayer. He reached out slowly with his free hand in the subterranean darkness. His cold fingertips made contact with the base of the ancient hearthstone. The bone and pine pulp that filled the central crack had hardened fully. It had hardened into a dense, crystalline substance in the freezing cold. The dense substance felt as cold as river ice beneath his trembling touch. As he pressed his bleeding hand against the cold crystal in the dark, the golden light radiating from the journal surged forward brightly. It illuminated a hidden drainage channel carved into the vault floor. The hidden channel stretched far into the pitch-black mountain bedrock. Its smooth, stone sides were lined with thin, delicate, glistening sheets. These sheets of pure mountain salt sparkled like diamonds under light. Gabriel pulled himself free from beneath the heavy oak beam with effort. His heavy boots sloshed through the shallow pool of salty, cold brine. He dragged his bruised body slowly toward the narrow stone opening ahead. He realized that the 34 parishioners had not been destroyed. They had not been destroyed by the falling masonry in the dark collapse. They had dissolved back into the soil from which their town was born. Their physical forms returned to the ancient boundary line forever now. It was the same boundary where ancestors had once cut the timber. He crawled along the salt line channel in the damp mountain shaft. His breath came in steady, rhythmic rasps that no longer tasted of clay. It no longer tasted of wet clay or oxidized copper scrap in his throat. The air inside the narrow shaft grew surprisingly fresh and cool now. It carried the sharp, clean scent of mountain cedar and wet granite. As he advanced, the narrow passageway began to slope upward slowly. It led toward a faint, natural light filtering through a stone fissure. Upon the cold stone wall beside the exit, carved in clean script, carved in the classical script of an earlier century, was an inscription. It was a short inscription that brought peace to his tormented spirit. The boundary of the parish is not measured in rods or chains at all. It is measured in the silence a man leaves when he lays down his pen. He turned the page of the ledger in his lap, watching the final leaf. The manuscript's final blank leaf had begun to absorb white salt. It absorbed the salt crystals from the cold air, preserving his record. When Reverend Gabriel Vance broke through the fissure at Berkshire Ridge, he emerged into the crisp, cold dawn of a pale October morning at last. The ancient village of Oakhaven was completely gone from the valley floor. The timber homesteads, the stone rectory, and wellhead were all gone. They had been completely subsumed by the dense, dark spruce forest around, leaving no trace or scrap of human habitation behind in the wild valley, where the church sanctuary had once stood so tall against the cold sky. A broad, circular grove of ancient white pine trees now grew peacefully. Their heavy, dark branches swayed gently in the cold mountain breeze. The silence that hung over the valley was no longer suffocating at all. It was no longer the cold, predatory quiet of the silent neighbor past. It was the natural, peaceful stillness of an untouched, quiet wilderness. It was a silent landscape completely untouched by the heavy hand of man. Gabriel knelt upon the damp, cold carpet of pine needles under his knees. He opened the heavy leather ledger across his knees in the morning air. The dark, gouged script of September and October had transformed fully. The aggressive geometric lines and dark powder had settled into deep marks. They settled into deep, clean impressions that resembled ancient tree rings. The 34 names of the parish congregation were legible once more. They were written in fine, glistening gold ink that sparkled brightly. It sparkled beneath the warm, rising morning sun in the clear mountain air. He took his sharp iron stylus and drew a single heavy line beneath it. He drew the line beneath the final entry, sealing the record forever. He sealed the lost record of Oakhaven for all remaining time in history. As he closed the heavy parchment volume, the emblem on the cover faded. The scorched emblem of two overlapping circles faded away completely now. It left the worn brown leather smooth, dry, and cool to his human touch. He stood up slowly, slinging the heavy ledger into his leather satchel. He turned his pale face toward the southern road leading to Boston City. He knew that when he presented the sacred journal to the distant bishops, they would find no financial ledgers or parish tax records inside it. They would find only a complete, unbroken record of a quiet, lost valley. A valley that had chosen to return quietly to the dark, silent earth. As he walked along the narrow deer trail that had once been Route 9, he paused quietly and looked back at the dense timber line one last time. Standing at the outer edge of the pine grove in the golden sunlight, bathed in the warm, rising sun, was a faint, translucent human outline. It was the translucent outline of Thomas Miller holding a surveyor's staff. The brass surveyor's staff gleamed faintly in the pale morning mist. The phantom figure did not speak or utter a single word in the cold. It raised its pale hand in a quiet, solemn gesture of final farewell, before dissolving gracefully and silently into the soft morning mist around. The quiet mist settled over the valley, sealing the unmapped boundary. The salt-lined drainage passage beneath the Berkshire Ridge did not terminate. It did not terminate in the natural mountain sunlight that he envisioned. Reverend Gabriel Vance had envisioned open sunlight in his fevered mind. The warm dawn air and the open grove of white pines were merely illusions. They were merely the first layer of a profound, cold hallucination in dark. A sensory shroud projected by the living clay to keep his hands moving. To keep his hands moving continuously across the parchment in total darkness. Gabriel opened his eyes to find himself still trapped 40 feet below. He was trapped 40 feet below the forest floor in the cold burial vault. He was pinned hard against the collapsed timber ceiling of the dark vault. The golden luminescence emanating from the ledger was not sunlight at all. It was a harsh, rhythmic pulse of subterranean energy radiating brightly. It radiated continuously from the cracked hearthstone in the cold chamber. The blue clay mask of the silent neighbor had not dissolved or faded. It had metastasized, creeping rapidly up the dry stacked fieldstones. It was sealing every microscopic crevice in the masonry with thick glaze. A petrified, cold glaze that tasted sickeningly of wet lye and bitter iron. Gabriel reached down with his uninjured left hand in the damp darkness. His fingers clawed through the damp, salt-laced mud to retrieve the tool. He retrieved the iron bodkin stylus resting in the cold subterranean mud. The manuscript lay open across his chest in the dark, cold chamber. Its parchment leaves crackled with an intense, localized static energy. The static turned dust particles in the air into tiny, suspended embers. As he touched the point of the stylus to the leaf marked October 24th, a low, mechanical thrumming echoed through the bedrock beneath his spine. It was a sound identical to the heavy iron gears of a dark water mill. A water mill grinding dry grain in the dark depths of the ancient earth. The entries were no longer forming in traditional English or Latin script. The dark, crystalline powder was arranging itself into geometric networks. Intricate, three-dimensional geometric networks that bled through paper. They bled through paper, burning their impressions into floorboards below. They burned impressions directly into oak floorboards beneath his back. The silence of Oakhaven was no longer a quiet absence of noise at all. It was an active, crushing pressure that forced air out of his lungs. It forced air out in short, crystalline bursts of white frost in the dark. The survey of Lower Valley cannot be concluded from above timber line. The collective voice rasped from dark alcoves behind the collapsed hearth. The 34 parishioners of Oakhaven had not faded into morning mist. Their clay-encrusted forms were embedded flush within earthen walls. Their pale faces formed a continuous, circular gallery of silent observers. Small, calcified roots protruded from their open, silent mouths in dark, interweaving with hemlock timber joists to form a massive, living cage. A living cage that bound the entire subterranean structure together firmly. You have recorded the names of living, but not inventoried weight. You have not yet inventoried the weight of stone above their heads. Every word you withhold from ledger adds an inch of solid granite. It adds an inch of solid granite to the ceiling of your dark tomb. Gabriel braced his heels against stone foundation in the dark cellar. His thumb drove the iron stylus deep into central margin of the book, forcing his own warm blood to saturate the geometric carvings fully, until the parchment began to smoke with the sharp scent of burning resin. The surge of blood and iron upon the ancient parchment broke the geometry. It broke the unnatural spatial geometry of the subterranean burial vault. With a deafening, dull roar that sounded like a mountainside sloughing down. It sounded like heavy earth sloughing into a deep, freezing riverbed. The clay-bound walls dissolved into a fine, dry shower of white salt. The crushing, suffocating pressure in Gabriel's chest abruptly released now, allowing a cold, clean draft of autumn air to sweep through the chamber. The 34 stone-faced parishioners did not fall forward in the dark. They calcified completely, their clay forms hardening into buttresses. Permanent, dry-stacked stone buttresses that supported the immense weight. They supported the crushing weight of the Berkshire Ridge above the cellar. The leather-bound ledger in Gabriel's trembling hands cooled instantly. Its parchment leaves turned stiff, dry, and smooth as slate in the cold, absorbing every drop of blood and dark ink into its fibrous paper core, until the entire surface was completely sealed behind a clear sheen. A glass-like sheen of crystallized white salt sealed the ledger forever. Gabriel pulled himself upward through the narrow chimney flue. He pulled himself up through the stone flue of the ancient rectory, breaking through the wet autumn leaves into the quiet gloom of forest. He emerged into the cold, silent gloom of the deep Berkshire forest. The heavy mountain storm had passed, leaving the canopy wrapped in fog. It left the high forest canopy wrapped in a dense, motionless fog. The thick fog muffled the distant sound of the flowing river below, where the village of Oakhaven had stood 3 short weeks prior to this. There was only an unbroken, rolling expanse of rich black topsoil now. It was completely cleared of timber, stone foundations, or human paths, leaving no physical trace of human life or parish memory in the valley. The ancient parish boundary stone sat embedded in the damp mud at feet. Its stone face was smooth and featureless, devoid of carved dates. It was completely devoid of any carved dates, names, or holy crosses. He tucked the cold, salt-sealed ledger into his worn leather satchel, knowing that the parish record was finally complete and closed forever, not as a map of human settlement or church property in the diocese, but as an absolute inventory of a valley that had closed its borders. A valley that had successfully closed its borders against spoken words. He walked south along the unpaved forestry track in the morning quiet. His heavy boots made no sound against damp pine needles on the trail. The soft needles were carpeted thickly over the old unpaved trail below. Case File 29C would eventually find its way into climate-controlled vaults. The dark vaults of the New England Historical Society in Boston City, bound tightly in its blackened twill, waiting silently for an archivist, waiting for another archivist to open its cold, salt-encrusted cover. But as Gabriel reached the high crest of the ridge and looked back, he looked back at the vast, green wilderness of the valley floor below. He knew that no voice would ever read those carved pages out loud. No human voice would read them without feeling the cold taste of salt, without feeling the cold, dry taste of salt rise in their throat. The silent neighbor remained at rest beneath the heavy hemlock roots, its ancient boundaries drawn, its complex parish accounts balanced fully, and its dark archive closed for all eternity beneath unmapped soil, beneath the cold, unmapped, silent soil of the Oakhaven parish bounds. If this file kept you awake tonight, leave a comment below with your thoughts, or share your own encounter. Until next time, pleasant nightmares.